Hi everyone, on behalf of AuditBoard, we would like to welcome you to today's webinar. Whether you're tuning in from across the street or across the globe, we're truly grateful to have you with us and appreciate you taking the time to listen to today's webinar.
We have some fantastic content coming your way, but let's get comfortable navigating the On24 platform together.
First things first, along the bottom of your screen, you'll find our most frequently asked questions, including solutions to common technical issues. Pro tip, if you lose audio, video, or your widgets freeze at any point during today's presentation, please try refreshing your browser to reconnect. That typically fixes most technical issues.
Today's webinar will have closed captioning. You can turn on the captions by clicking the CC button in the bottom right of the media player on the right-hand side of your screen.
The resource list widget can be found on the left of the screen. Presentation slides will be located there and emailed to participants after the webinar if the speaker has provided approval to share. While you're checking out the resource list, don't forget to follow AuditBoard on LinkedIn to stay up to date on future events, content, and news.
Make sure to also click through various banners to see upcoming webinars, events, or even to schedule a product walkthrough with an expert.
We'd love to hear from you today during the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to send them through the Q&A widget at the bottom left of your screen. Feel free to use it throughout the session. We'll be checking in and answering questions at the end. Don't worry, we've got a team helping to keep an eye on any CPE or On24 inquiries.
That is a great segue into our last reminder. To qualify for CPE, you must attend 50 minutes of the live session and answer 3 poll questions. The polls are presented in the slide window, and the submit button can be found by scrolling to the bottom of the poll. The certification widget on the top left of your screen will show if you qualify for your CPE. Again, if the certification widget freezes or you can't see a poll, refresh your browser. If you qualify for your CPE, your certificate will be emailed to you after the webinar. If you do not receive your certificate by the end of the day, please reach out to webinars@auditboard.com, and we would be happy to look into this for you.
Thank you again for joining us on this webinar. It's time to sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Marissa, and I'm part of the marketing and events team here at AuditBoard, and I'm excited to host today's presentation. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Mary Kroska, who's the Director of Product Marketing, Risk and Platform at AuditBoard. We have a great session ahead, so let's get right into it. I'll now hand it over to Mary. So Mary, why don't you take it away?
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Kreska. So I'm one of the directors here at AuditBoard, overseeing a lot of our risk in our platform side. I'm really excited to spend the next hour with you guys talking through kind of navigating this new risk landscape. So to set the stage, I wanted to talk about kind of one of the key things that we'll go through today over the next hour. And this is really about our risk intelligence report. So AuditBoard this past year actually did a benchmarking report with our customers as well as a third party. So this risk intelligence report, which we're going to kind of go through over the next hour or so, really draws on 2 complementary data sets. So one of the things is that we looked at some of the proprietary AuditBoard platform telemetry, which is awesome. So we were able to really dive in and see real world activity, kind of including AI usage, control adoption, framework mappings, and really where a lot of the customers are kind of collaborating and using some things. And then in addition to that, we also partnered with a third party to actually go out and interview about 400 risk leaders kind of across North America, but also across Europe as well, really understanding how they're diving into governance, things around risk maturity, and then some of their investment priorities for the upcoming year. So this is going to really set the stage about a lot of what we're talking about today. But again, with this report, our goal was really to understand what are risks that are really top of mind for the enterprises, and then how are different organizations managing the risk with AI as well as kind of across various functions. And ultimately, we're going to talk about something called the risk maturity gap that we'll dive into. So it's really understanding, what are their leading organizations doing versus what are some of the lagging organizations doing on there as well. So to set the stage, here's the agenda. The first thing we're gonna do is talk about kind of the current state of risk. So really, what are all of you guys experiencing in your everyday? Then we're gonna get into what we call the middle maturity trap. So I'm gonna go into really what that is, where it comes from, kind of what we see from a data standpoint. And then we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about the 5 dimensions of risk intelligence that we see here at AuditBoard, as well as get into a strategic roadmap. So really moving from activity to impact and how you guys can take away some key things to leverage. And throughout all this, I will have time at the end for some Q&A, but I encourage you guys to ask questions as they come up. And then as we go to some polling questions, I'll kind of answer them throughout the way as well. And on that, let's get started and really talk about the reality of risk today. So risk is more complex, dynamic, and interconnected than ever before. This is not new. This is not a change. This is something that you guys are really living and experiencing every single day. However, what is changing is just really the rapid increase in what is happening in the world and when it comes to risk. So whenever we talk about like, here's a new risk state of today, I like to think about everything even post kind of the COVID world, because I think at this time, everything pre-COVID with where technology was, where risk, where AI was, really is different. And so kind of in that post era, one of the things we did was we went forward and we actually interviewed people and said, what are you guys really seeing in the market? And we saw that 7 in 10 leaders actually said that the risk landscape is more complex than even 2 years ago. And if you think about that, a lot of that really is honestly driven from AI and the fact that if AI became more widely adopted and used within the last 2 years. And with that really brought a bunch of new risks, but it also brought a bunch of regulation changes. So even if you fast forward from the COVID area, different regulators and regulations are really changing to kind of adapt and figure out the right way to govern the state of the world that we live in today. And then in addition to that, you have this adoption of AI that has just been faster than ever before. And so what it's doing is it's creating kind of a perfect complexity of a world that is really difficult for risk leaders to manage, technology that's trying to keep up, but then also new innovation with technology. And so we're going to talk about how this really sets the stage for what we call that middle maturity trap. And we're really going to get into that. But ultimately, the middle maturity trap, it really is the disconnect between what enterprises are doing, so like their intent, and what they're actually able to achieve as well. And so we'll dive in to really what a lot of this means. And on that definition, let's get into what is the middle maturity trap. So one thing that we noticed when we looked into a lot of our telemetry data was that we saw a lot of spikes in usage. And so we wanted to understand really when that was and why there are certain spikes. We saw that when a lot of people really started to adopt AI and use technology, use it, that there was a high collaboration that really came out of there. However, we noticed that they were really only happening throughout certain times of the year. And so that's where we went in and we partnered with that third party to really understand why is that. And what we found is that a lot of enterprises are still leveraging the collaboration tools and leveraging technology, but they're doing it only when there is a need. So if there is an audit happening, or if they're getting pressure from an executive, or there's something that's really making them want to adopt the technology. And so we found that pretty interesting because that really sets the standard for what differentiates leaders and laggers into this overall kind of risk maturity gap. So there were kind of 3 insights that we found overall from the report. And the first one is that AI adoption is accelerating, but trust is still fragile. And so this is talking more about how more than half of enterprises are implementing AI tools and investing in skills. However, the telemetry data shows that acceptance rates really dip sharply when governance is unclear. And so that means that decision times are lengthening, confidence in AI output is really inconsistent. And then there are some governance gaps that may lead many in kind of this stuck in this like pilot mode. And so this volatility really makes AI more visible and more urgent. So that's kind of coming and testing the maturity of organizations. And that's where we find that a lot of organizations are stuck in this middle maturity gap. So activity is high. They are updating their frameworks. They are updating controls. They're trying to get controls adopted. They have risks and they're logging risks. However, consistency is really missing across the board. And so they have bursts of progress that are followed by lapses, leaving kind of this resilience incomplete. And then third is that leaders really turn governance into an advantage. So when we broke down and really looked at the organizations that were leading overall, what we found is that those who we classify as leaders, they're really embedding risk in everything that they do. So they embed risk in board agendas. They align teams on shared KPIs. They sustain collaboration really as a discipline. And so the result is not just this oversight, but it's actually more into the foresight. And so that's really where you see leaders trying to get out of this trap of they're doing a lot of things, they have high intent, but they're actually doing it throughout the year. And so oftentimes the question comes up of really what is this, this middle maturity gap that you're in? And it's when you have high intent as an organization, so you're doing a lot of the work, you're updating controls, you're mapping frameworks, you're really doing a lot. However, you're not really able to get into that leading category where you're allowing risk to be in everything that you do. It's from the top down, you bring it into all the decisions that you really have as well. And so that's how you get stuck in this really middle maturity trap. And we're gonna talk through how we kind of see people start to get out of that. But on the first one, we're gonna kick it off with our first polling question. So what's one of the main obstacles preventing you from escaping that middle maturity gap? So think internally, think about at your organization, what is it that maybe is preventing you from becoming one of those leading organizations? Is it that there's inconsistent execution? So maybe your team or your organization is just updating things when there is an external push, or there is a compelling event to do that. Maybe it's just when an audit comes up. Maybe you guys have gaps or lack of clarity in governance overall. And so on that, maybe there's not a clear governance structure. Maybe you're unsure who the owner is on there. And maybe just a lack of resources. Maybe you're a team of one or a team of two. And so trying to, really figure out how to get risk into everything that you do and become kind of a risk-based decisions is really not something that's there. Or maybe it's something totally else as well. So think about internally kind of where you're at and what's really preventing you from getting to that leading organization. What's kind of keeping you in this middle area where you have high intent, you're doing all of the right things, but you just can't seem to really get out and become that leader, really have risk at the forefront over there. And I see we're almost at about 90%, so I'll give you guys another 10 or so seconds to go ahead and get your answer in for this very first polling question. All right, let's see where we are at. Perfect, okay. So the majority of the people, it's actually a pretty even split between the first three, which is actually awesome. So there's inconsistent execution, gaps or lack of clarity in governance, and then a lack of total resources. So that's really good to see. We also did this webinar last week in the States, and a lot of people were on that lack of governance is really where that came in. So definitely a consistent theme that we see kind of across the board. But I want you guys to kind of think about this as we go through the next part of this webinar, because ultimately that'll kind of help you guys think about what do you have to do to really get out of that middle maturity gap. What's one tangible thing you guys can take away and really bring back to your organization overall? And so let's talk about this disconnect that we saw when we dove into our telemetry data as well as the third-party research that we did. What we saw is that a lot of people are ambitious. But the reality is a lot of organizations, which you saw, if you look at the last one, don't really have the capabilities or aren't really ready to kind of take that next step. So on the intent side, 53% of enterprises report implementing AI-specific tools, yet 39% plan to expand AI and machine learning, and then 70% expect to increase risk management staffing over the next 2 years. So that's good, but it also means that it might not be a resourcing thing, but sometimes it is a skills thing, or sometimes it's just working internally on collaboration, which we'll get into. And for me, one of the things that really stands out the most when I look at this is that if 53% are implementing AI-specific tools, which is good. If you think about it, think about how your organization is. Is there one where maybe you guys have a license to a certain GPT that you're able to use? but only 39% plan to actually invest in AI and machine learning skills. For me, that's a disconnect right there, because I know on my side, I use AI, but I use AI on a very basic level. And because I don't have the skill set, but one of the biggest things that I see, especially as we look at those organizations that are in that leading category, that they are trying to invest in at least one person on their team to have those skills, to be the AI or the machine learning person. So they're actually able to use AI and use analytics to get to that overall kind of next level. And so that's something that I noticed, and it kind of stuck out to me right away, is that you can implement all the tools that you want, but if you don't have the right skill set to use it, you're never going to really achieve kind of the full, your full ability there as well. And so going into this, this really, again, kind of level sets where a lot of organizations are. We have really good intent, really ambitious, but the reality is that there's still those governance gaps. That decision-making is still done in silo. There's kind of stop and go engagement. People are really updating a lot of their overall structure and governance things when there is a need. And this is where we want to introduce the risk intelligence framework overall. And so this is a framework that we put together just based on different research that we did talking to kind of customers overall. And so what it really talks about is that when it comes to true maturity, it's not just about activity for its own sake. It's not just about how many controls you have. It's not just about how many frameworks you're able to manage. You know, logging risks, mapping frameworks, running audits, those are absolutely necessary, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're mature on there as well. And so what matters is whether these activities are performed consistency, at speed, and at scale. So we actually did a previous research that really dove into how do you truly measure maturity of a program overall. And so what we found in that research is that it's based on those three things: level, consistency, and speed. So level, the scope or the volume of activity. So is it appropriate? Do you have a large enough level of activity happening at your organization to really meet the industry that you're in and meet your needs? Consistent. How reliable are those activities over time? Is this something that you're kind of in this continuous audit cycle, or are you continually updating frameworks or updating controls? And then the speed. How quickly are you as an enterprise able to act once a risk or a control or a new insight's identified? If there's a change in regulation, how quickly are you able to adapt and kind of go for these changes? So we took those three things, that the level, consistency, and speed. And what we did is we combined it with this new research as well as kind of the own proprietary data set in aggregate. We were able to really identify this true measure of holistic success. And so based on this holistic analysis, we identified kind of 5 core dimensions of how organizations can truly mature and become leaders. And I see some of the questions come in around, you know, what really is a leader? What does it mean? And so we'll get into some examples of what it means when you're a leader in a situation. Is you're an enterprise that risk is not something that you think about in silo. You are talking to the board, you are talking to your executive team, everyone is speaking the same risk language. You have your audit team, your compliance team really working kind of in unison as well, and your GRC team. And so we'll get into some of these examples as we really dive into this. But the 5 kind of core dimensions that we're going to go into is around AI and automation. So how widely and efficiently is AI used within your organization to generate, accept, and act on insights? Second is around control maturity. So what's the speed and reliability of control adoption? Third is frameworks and coverage. So the breadth and depth of the governance structures. 4 is collaboration. And this is one that definitely it has a lot of debate on. There is a lot more, it's probably one of the more challenging ones to really get in as well. And then last is risk and issues discipline. So the rigor of logging, tracking, and remediating risks overall. And when we get there, kind of that's going to be one of the big things I'll talk about, is really on the remediation side. And so we view this framework as kind of that gold standard for how leading enterprises are really approaching connected risk overall. And so the value of this is that this is not just us coming up with something, but we actually found this from a variety of the telemetry data that we had, as well as the third parties. And so these are kind of the core areas for you guys to think about in your organization. Before we jump into all those, we're going to get to our second polling question. And so what does your organization's current AI adoption look like? And so I'll let you guys get into this. The first one, maybe you're exploring ideas, but no formal pilots yet. So maybe it's one where your organization hasn't really adopted an overall AI governance structure. Maybe you guys don't have an approved GPT that you're able to use yet. Maybe you're just kind of using it ad hoc. Maybe you guys are running small pilot or proofs of concept. So maybe in your team, whether you're in audit, whether you're in GRC, you guys are actually trying to bring AI in and you have a small proof of concept. You're saying, I want to learn how we can start to automate this subset of controls. And we're going to go and just run it there. Maybe you're scaling AI across different functions. So maybe you are using AI in audit, and then again, on the compliance side, you guys are using it, and maybe your enterprise risk team is also. And maybe you guys have mature adoption with governance in place. You have a full AI governance policy, you have an owner, you have insights. That has kind of been distilled overall as well. Or maybe you're not sure. So where are you guys really at on this scale and at this range of what AI adoption looks like? All right, and on there, let's see where we are at. Okay, so a lot of people are running the small kind of pilots and proofs of concept, and that's actually consistent with what we saw last week too, for when we ran this over in the States as well, is that people are starting to adopt AI tools. And there are questions that come in of like, which AI am I talking about? So when it comes to AI, obviously that's a broad thing, and it's going to depend on your organization. We're Google Suites, we use Gemini here. That's an approved one that we have, but you guys might be building maybe an internal AI or internal LLM at your organization, or maybe you guys have an enterprise license with OpenAI or with Gemini or with Anthropic. There are different AI tools out there. I am definitely keeping it vague. I don't know exactly what each organization's using. So kind of think about it from that side and how you're leveraging AI overall. Or maybe it's in your GRC software. And if you do have one, you're actually using it kind of being embedded overall. Okay, and on there, let's talk about this first dimension. So AI and automation. So what we found when we looked at our telemetry data and how customers are really using AI is that they're using AI, and in this instance, I'm talking about the AI within AuditBoard, but they're really using it to draft audit narratives, to accelerate control mappings, generate insights at a speed that would have been unthinkable many years ago. I mean, I still think about when I was a staff auditor and I had to map different frameworks together. It would take me 40 to 60 hours just to map ISO and SOC 2 together. Or if I had to bring in PCI from that side. And then if there was a new regulation that came out, for me to try to understand what that regulation was, where are the changes in the controls, what's the changes in the current environment, that would take me weeks, months even, to go and manually have to understand that. And so we're finding is that a lot of organizations are using AI to really help with this, to help with reading these new regulations, understanding what the changes are, generating controls, doing the mapping, taking that manual work out, which is really good. And if we looked internally, we found that there were certain months where this AI activity was robust. Teams generated large volumes of output and accepted a high proportion of them. And what happened was when they were using AI and internally, decision times kind of averaged just a few hours, first maybe weeks. However, a lot of this was only for a short amount of time. So when AI adoption was up, decision times went down. And then what we found is that in the months later, it kind of lagged. And so that's where we went in and tried to understand with doing third-party research of why is that. We found that people were using AI when there was a need. It wasn't necessarily embedded in kind of their everyday and how they were going in. And so that makes sense if you really think about it. In many enterprises, ownership of AI oversight, it remains still very unclear. And it leaves kind of enthusiasm unchecked and the trust fragile. I mean, especially as an auditor, you want to trust, but you want to verify. And so if there is a new AI tool, you have to make sure that if you're leveraging it, you can have those outputs that you truly do trust. And so when we looked at the leading organizations, so organizations that are using AI almost every day, it's part of kind of who they're at. They have full AI governance programs that are really happening. Leaders really address that gap directly. They define decision rights, they establish governance frameworks, and they build internal skills to validate AI output. So it's not just trusting the output that you get, but they're actually teaching their employees and their skills to critically think about the output and make sure that it is truly right. And if you remember earlier, I said that 53% of enterprises are implementing, but only 39% are actually investing in skills. Again, you kind of can start to see that overlap. And so these were some of the things that the leaders really started to do. However, in contrast, the laggers were really only using AI when needed. And so they weren't using it to kind of its full advantage from that side. And so beyond efficiency gains, AI and automation, they're really redefining the audit function itself. And so teams are using generative AI to draft narratives, again, accelerate control mapping, analyze evidence at scale, which is awesome. And so it's reducing kind of cycle times from just weeks to days. But what that does is that it frees up auditors from some of those repetitive tasks. And so it allows you to have more time to think strategically, to say, hey, wait a second, I'm noticing that this control has failed continuously over the last year or two. What's going on there? I want to now spend my time on more of a root cause analysis. And so that's allowing for a more resilient organization overall. And so what we're kind of take out of this is that when enterprises treat AI purely as an experiment or something that they can just kind of use, they're not able to actually get to that next level and think a bit more critically. And so this is where kind of one of the next steps I'm going to ask everyone here is that think about internally how you guys are using AI. And maybe you guys have your own LLM. Maybe you guys are just using OpenAI or Gemini or one of those. Or maybe you guys are one of the organizations that have an actual governance over it. But think about how you're using it and then make sure you guys have defined ownership over AI governance. And that's really important before you guys can start to scale those pilots and establish really the internal validation side. And so think about that. Do you have that governance structure in place? And if so, what can you do next? Let's go to those pilot groups. Let's start to build this out. If not, let's kind of take that first step. What do we want our overall governance to really be there? And then this gets into our second dimension, which is around control maturity. So controls are the mechanism that turn policy into practice. They define how risks are mitigated, how compliance is enforced, how resilience is built into daily operations. But maturity in controls is not measured by how many are documented. It's really about how they are adopted. And so this is something that I think is so important and often overlooked. And when I think about my time as an external auditor, and I would go with organizations, I kind of, based on their overall maturity, would see a difference. I would go into some organizations who didn't even know that they had controls in place. And maybe it was they just did a SOC 2 or they had ISO, and they would have a whole bunch of controls that they actually didn't know that they had. They didn't know who the owners were. They just knew they needed it because some auditor came in there and told them that they had to have controls. That means that they're not adopted, so they're not really effective. Additionally, I had clients on the other side where they would give me a list of thousands of controls, and they'd say, look at how amazing and robust our control library is. We have thousands upon thousands of controls. We need it to meet all of these regulations. And I was like, that's awesome, but are these controls effective? Do we need all of these controls? And so when I would go in from more of the advisory standpoint, I'd work with a lot of my customers to go in and say, do we really need these controls? Are these right? Let's go and let's talk to the front line. Let's talk about these business processes. Let's understand how your business is operating and which controls we truly need in place, whether it's from a preventative standpoint, whether it's from a mitigating standpoint. And let's make this control library not only long, but really robust. And let's make sure the controls actually are adopted. Because you can have all the controls in the world, but if your front line isn't using them, or they're not owning them, or they're not in place, then they're not really going to do much on that control mitigation side. And so from the risk intelligence report, what we found was actually really similar if we looked at this. The telemetry data really provide kind of a snapshot of how control usage, whether it's controls being updated or controls being adopted by the front line, again, kind of staggered. And so when we looked in certain months, when adoption was strong, teams were really quickly able to adopt and change. However, when controls weren't being updated or it wasn't throughout the year, we realized that those were the organizations that, again, were kind of stuck in that middle gap. They were updating things because there was a need, because an external auditor came in and told them they had to, or maybe you're in a situation where it was your internal audit team coming and kind of remind you that you had these controls in place. And so based on the telemetry data, based on also the third party research, what we really found is that control adoption accelerates when governance and bandwidth are aligned. However, if they're not aligned, then control adoption is really not there. So boards tend to discuss risk really only reactively. And for what we found is about for 50% of enterprises, it's not really a standing agenda at the board level. And so this is where leading organizations come in and start to distinguish themselves. They integrate risk oversight into regular board and executive reviews. They have shared KPIs across audit, risk, and compliance. And they formalize adoption processes that controls are embedded collectively instead of sporadically. Flaggers, by contrast, they continue to adopt controls kind of reactively, often only in response to that regulatory deadline as well. And so what we found is that enterprises that integrate control adoption into the governance structures and treat this as a steady discipline, making controls a consistent safeguard against emerging risks. And so those who adopt it sporadically are kind of left in that last minute cycle of, oh no, I have to go ahead and make updates. And so you don't really have a strong framework for your organization, and you actually leave yourself subject to more risk when kind of those changing external things are really coming up and coming here as well. And so true maturity truly comes in when adoption is predictable, it's repeatable, and it's collective. And so there are a few kind of key takeaways from here, but also things that I want you guys to think about when you think about your own organization. So remembering that leaders really embed control into their overall governance structure within their organization. So they align KPIs, they integrate oversight into board agendas, and they adopt periodically. So think about your organization, think about your team, and think about where you stand. Are the controls that you're having, do you guys have shared KPIs across audit, across risk, across your compliance teams? Or are you not? Are you working with those teams? Are you working kind of across the three lines as well? So where are you guys at that kind of level of maturity as well? Do you have shared controls? Have you gone through and actually is the ownership on that front line? Are you having them take ownership into updating the controls, into making sure that they're actually embedded within the organization? And is that getting reported up to the board? So kind of think about where you're standing and where you guys can start to really make changes within your own organization as well, and start small. And that's going to be one of the big things as we get through all of this, is you're going to want to make sure that you're starting kind of small as we get into everything overall, those pilot groups. And so this brings us into frameworks and coverage. So frameworks are the scaffolding of risk management. So they provide that structure, that common language, the alignment with regulatory standards. However, their value depends on more than just the number of frameworks you have adopted. What matters is really the depth and how thoroughly you guys are actually managing those. And so what this means, again, when I think through a lot of the customers that I used to work with, oftentimes they would come and say, I have a library of frameworks. And now obviously, when you think through internationally here, I have 7 different, let's just say ISO standards. Maybe you guys have 27001, maybe it's 3001, maybe it's one of the new ones that are coming out. But you have a variety of frameworks that you really want to manage. However, when you dive into that, when I would ask them, like, that's awesome. Now, which one is kind of one of your core frameworks? And maybe it's, obviously, if you have to be in compliance with. Maybe it's UK corporate governance, maybe it's DORA. But what are you guys using as kind of your framework baseline? Are you mapping the additional things that you need to those regulations? Are you guys actually looking at your overall program holistically, or are you managing all of the stuff kind of one-off? Because that's really the difference when it comes in. And so what we found when we look at the telemetry data is that in the months where data was available that we had, the median enterprises, they map its controls to about 7 different frameworks, which is around 2,700 requirements, which is a lot. And if you think about yours, you might say, yeah, you know, we're something similar to that. Now, the reality is it's impossible to manage that every single day without thinking through which requirements are more impactful for your organization. And that was always one as an external auditor 101 when you would go and you would understand a company is this requirement relevant to this organization? Is it a high enough risk? So the same comes when it comes to frameworks as well and how you're thinking through it. Is it's great to have all those frameworks, but is it actually impactful? So what is the most important to your organization? Do you have it mapped? So the leading organizations that we saw is they go further. So they embed thousands of more requirements into their monitoring and reporting process. However, the surface is that they actually have a standard kind of operating model. So they think through which requirements, which frameworks, which regulations are the most important to their organization and how they can really manage those overall. They treat these frameworks as a living system, and they prioritize deep mapping to really support this and real-time monitoring and real-time updates. So when you look at it, you take that risk-based approach. So again, if you think through the leading organizations here, they embed risk in everything they do. That also comes with how they manage their frameworks and their coverage. What's the riskiest one to my organization? Where am I the most susceptible? Now let me put monitors on those. Let me make sure that I have the most robust programs built out around those, that my controls are continuously monitored. They're updated kind of throughout there. And so that's one of the biggest differences that we really see. And this was actually also found from the survey finding. So from the survey we did, 35% of enterprises are adopting new frameworks and 45% are updating existing ones. However, the majority of them did actually say that compliance was really just surface level. So again, that's really on the where you have all these different frameworks, but you're not necessarily making it a living system. So again, those leaders, they really treat it as a living system. They selectively expand their breadth while ensuring their depth. They're mapping requirements kind of thoroughly as well. And so think about your organization and think about kind of how you guys are managing your overall frameworks and your overall coverage. Are you guys on the framework alphabet soup where maybe you have a whole long list and you have 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 requirements your organization has to be in compliance with? There is a good chance that's the case, but how are you actually managing those? Because it's impossible to manage it at surface level. So how are you actually making sure that your organization is resilient? Are you guys thinking through it from the risk perspective? Are you guys actually putting monitors on the most impactful controls and the most impactful requirements? This is, if you can see, that's kind of how it's all really coming together. And so that's what I want you guys to kind of think through your coverage. And your coverage is updating frameworks really part of kind of what you guys are doing on a continuous basis? Or are you more on, oh, I have an audit coming up, or oh, I have to report on this, so I'm going to go and kind of dive in and see really where we're at. And on that, we're going to bring us to our next poll question. So what's the biggest obstacle to collaborate within your organization? And I'm really curious what a lot of you guys are going to come back and say, because our next topic is going to be on collaboration, which is probably one of the stickiest because it requires human involvement. And whenever there are humans involved, that means human nature comes into play. And that usually means complications come in as well. So think about your guys' organization. Are you guys siloed, cultivated by kind of outdated technology? Maybe you guys are using some legacy tool. Maybe you guys have different technologies. Is there a resistance to change? Maybe the culture from the top down is we don't want to work together. We don't want to break down our silos. Is there a lack of buy-in from leadership? Maybe they don't see the audit function or the governance function or the compliance function as a value add, as a risk organization. Are there concerns around independence? Is it one where from the internal audit standpoint, you're worried about getting too involved because from the independent standpoint? So where are you guys at? Or maybe it's something totally different. But when you think about your program, think about your organization, what's really your biggest obstacle for collaboration? And on that, we'll kind of see where we're at as well. Okay, so I'll give you guys a couple more seconds to go ahead and really dive in here. We're almost at about 90%, which is awesome. So get in there, and then I'll go ahead and change to the next question. Or seeing the results. Perfect. All right. So let's see where we're at. So from the group, the majority say that we have kind of siloed operations cultivated by outdated technology. So that makes sense. Maybe you're using different systems to perform the same task. Actually, in one of the surveys that we did, we found that on average, organizations are using 3 different GRC softwares just to manage their governance, risk, and compliance programs overall. Or maybe you're on a legacy system that is really outdated, that doesn't have the newest capabilities. Then resistance to change. So this is actually the most common one that we see in last week. That was the one that led as well, is that there's a lot of resistance to change. And so we're going to talk about some of that when we get in here. And like I said, collaboration is definitely one of the hardest to kind of change and really get in. So we'll talk about a little bit of how you guys can kind of start small when you get in here as well. All right, so collaboration, if you think about it, it's really the glue that brings us all together. We talked about how leaders are able to bring controls and frameworks into kind of their living system. They're able to have shared KPIs, but you can't do any of that if you're not collaborating across teams. You can't have shared KPIs if you don't have buy-in from everybody else. So it really is the glue that makes a lot of this truly possible. Audit, compliance, InfoSec, risk teams, everyone brings unique responsibilities, even without collaboration. So when you think about it, you are the expert in your area. So if you are on the audit side, you really understand the business overall and how the business operates. If you're on the InfoSec side, they really understand the cyber threats. Maybe you are on the risk side, you're a chief risk officer, or you're on the ERM team. Your job is to think about the top risk to your enterprises, and you really can't do that unless you're kind of collaborating across them. But knowing that mindset is really important because everyone brings a unique perspective, and together you can see, well, what's the most important thing for my organization? So we'll talk about some of the data, and then we'll talk about a little bit of the tips and tricks as well. So the telemetry data that we saw found is that there is a surge in collaboration. So there was a surge in uptake in Teams, in Slack messages, and email automations when teams were, again, adopting AI, updating controls. But they were only during certain periods of the year. So they were still, for the most part, in this state where they were triggered by something external for a reason to update everything. When we dove in to the survey, what we found is that a lot of enterprises still remain siloed. And so there's governance that keeps teams apart. And so in those environments, collaboration only happens in response to an external trigger when maybe there's an audit coming up and somebody who you have to go and collect things from says, hey, I already gave it to that team. Or maybe at that point you have an executive mandate to say, hey, I need my compliance and my audit team to work together on this. The collaboration was not necessarily there. And so what we found is that leaders make collaboration part of their operating model. They hold regular cross-functional risk meetings. They align those teams on shared KPIs, and they institutionalize collaboration through predictable routines. And so what this means is that the outcomes kind of diverge clearly. Leaders surface risks sooner. They resolve them more consistently because collaboration is embedded. Again, if you think about how everyone is kind of a SME in their own area, it's going to be your InfoSec person or your cyber person who's going to most likely know and identify some of those cyber threats right away. It's going to be probably someone on the audit side who's going to understand where the cracks in the foundation of your business are. So it's important for the teams to work together. So one of the most important, or one of the most common questions that I get is, this is great, and if you see this, but my team doesn't want, or my company doesn't want to. There is a push to not work together. InfoSec doesn't want audit in all of their business. Somebody doesn't want compliance to really get in there. And so that's kind of the mindset that needs to become overcome to truly start to become a leader. And that's challenging because you have to change the mindset of an individual and sometimes the culture of your organization. And so the first recommendation I always say is start small. You can't boil the ocean overnight. So think through, again, from that risk base, what is one area that if I got one partner and on board with, I can start to make an impact. I can bring that pilot group. So think through what's a really good area for me to focus on first. And I'm just going to focus on that. And then think through who can be a champion internally. So maybe it's somebody that has a lot of pull at the organization. Maybe it's someone who has a lot of visibility. Get somebody who can be a champion with you, and then figure out how to come and make them your champion and partner with them first, and ultimately bring in more people down the road. And so with this, when you're trying to get started, think about what's in it for them. Whenever you want to get started and you want to get somebody on board, you have to think about what's in it for them and then sell the value of it to them. So maybe it's somebody in the risk organization, and from the audit side, you want to help them or collaborate more with them. How can you help them achieve one of their goals? What is one of their goals, and what do you have that can help them achieve it? And then prove yourself to them. Get them on board. Show them how collaboration can help them succeed in their role. And then have that person start to be your champion. You can slowly kind of build this out as you continue to go along the way. And so, let's see. So when you think through that, it can kind of help with some of the cross-functional collaboration as well. And then some of the key things that we talked about that you can kind of implement on a smaller basis is shared KPIs. And so again, if you think about what's in it for them, think about what's one of their objectives, but then what's something that they're measured on. So what is it, again, they care about? And then which of that can you help with? What can you then create a shared KPI kind of across the board? And how can you hold regular cross-functional meetings with them? Again, start with one and then add more people on. And you build that predictable routine. You start to build a governance structure with them. And slowly you can start to add more and more people into the organization to kind of collaborate. And so that's really how you start to move from the laggard to that middle maturity and ultimately become a leader overall. Okay, and the next dimension is on the risks and issues discipline. So capturing risks, surfacing issues, developing remediation plans, it's the backbone of all mature risk management. It's part of the risk management framework. So without reliable processes for logging exposures and following up, enterprises cannot truly be at the forefront and really make sure that you're using risk to your advantage. So what we found when we looked at our telemetry data was that risk is not really even kind of throughout. So in those periods, again, where there was a stronger coverage, where people were adopting AI, there was controls being updated, action plans were created at a meaningful volume. However, what we found is that it kind of lagged off and a lot of people weren't following through on this. And from the survey data, we also found that this is true. So enterprises that were conducting 6 or more risk assessments per year report stronger overall risk discipline. They know the risk captured shouldn't just be periodic, but ongoing. They were also more likely to have increased assessment frequency over the last 2 years. With, again, if you remember at the beginning, we talked about how risk has continued to kind of become even more complex in the last 2 years. Those in the leading category have increased the amount of risk assessments that they're actually performing. And so by maintaining this kind of steady evaluation, and so what happened is that, by contrast, the median enterprises conducted fewer assessments. And this is something that I saw often when I would go in and companies would hire me and come and do a risk assessment for them, whether it was an annual one, whether it was a cyber risk assessment. Is I would go in and I'd always start, if it was a repeat one that I would do every year, I would always start with the issues and the action plans. And I'd say, let's talk about the top risks that you had last year. and the action plans that you had. And what I found was that the majority of them had not opened or looked at it since I left the following year. They had not remediated any of those gaps. They had not looked at any of the issues, or maybe they only did one, but it kind of fell off the radar. And the survey data actually found the same thing, is that when you look at the overall risk management framework, that last one, actually action on this, is really where it kind of falls off the wayside as well. And so this is really probably the biggest difference between enterprises that are in that leading category, is they shift from periodic assessments to almost continuous monitoring. So you saw that on average, they were doing about 6 assessments a year. That means that they're doing them, it could be on a cadence, it can be when there's a need to it, but they're understanding what's going on within their organization versus just doing it one-off and maybe not even knowing what those action plans are. And so this is definitely one of the most important things that organizations can kind of do and take in. And so I want you guys to think about your team. I want you to think about how many risk assessments you're doing a year. Is it one that you guys are just doing an annual risk assessment? Maybe it's not your team who's managing it, but you don't even know the answer to that. Maybe it's a team that you're not necessarily collaborating with. Well, that can be a reason to reach out, understand their process, understand where it's at, see if you can help them on this side, on this area as well. Or maybe you guys are doing risk assessments ad hoc. Maybe it's you do a minimum of 4 a year, but then when there's a risk event, you go ahead and you do an assessment on that. So think through how you're really bringing risk and risk behavior into your overall program. And if you're letting it drive your program, drive the outcomes, or if it's more of just kind of a one-off thing as well. And so that's something to kind of take away and think through how you can go back and make a change in your organization as well. And that'll bring us to our last poll question. So which of the 5 pillars, which of the 5 pillars could you use most to support your organization? So at the end of each area, I kind of asked you guys to think about your own organization internally as well, and think about really where you guys are at. So going back on all of these, which one can use the most support in your organization? And I want you guys to think about it, because that's the area that I want you to start to kind of work on it and take this back as well. And we'll get into that strategic roadmap right after this. Because again, when it comes to making a change, you have to start small. You want to make sure you have that good governance structure so you can start to kind of build it out. So maybe it's AI and automation. Maybe you guys are using AI, but it's not something that's really built into everything you do, where you don't have a strong governance program overall, or maybe you're not sure where governance is. Maybe it's on the control maturity. Maybe you are that person, that organization or your team, that you have a control library of 1,500 different controls, but the reality is they're not really being adopted. Maybe you're on the frameworks and coverage. You have the framework alphabet, your organization. You have someone who comes and says, I need this, I need that. But is that true? Does your organization truly need that? Is it going to add value? Maybe you're on the collaboration piece. Maybe you're in that organization where really breaking down those silos, really getting buy-in is a difficult thing. Maybe it's a risk and issues discipline. Maybe you do an annual risk assessment. Maybe you do a couple, but there really isn't much around remediating it, about tracking those issues overall. So think through, and maybe it's all of them, but if that's the case, then which one do you think you want to go ahead and kind of focus and build a roadmap around overall? So I'll give you guys another little bit of time to go ahead and click this as we really go into this as well. Okay. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and we are going to look at the results of this. Okay, AI and automation. Perfect. And then control maturity. Awesome. So in this next slide, I'm going to start to talk about kind of a strategic roadmap. So I want you guys to think about whichever one you picked and how you can start to implement some of the stuff at your organization as well. All right, so the path forward, 3 phases of maturity. So again, do not boil the ocean. I know we say that, but I can't reiterate it enough. When you work with organizations, they try to do too much at once. And it makes sense. It's human nature. You get excited about something and you want to do everything. But the reality is to truly make something sustainable and to really have it become part of every day, you have to start small and have a good structure. So we talked about those 5 dimensions of risk intelligence. You guys went through and added which one do you really want to focus on. And so enterprises need to start to kind of build this out. So there's a few different phases. The first is around establishing governance clearly. So define ownership and accountability throughout enterprise risk committees. So think again about what you want to do and which one you kind of want to focus on. So let's say you guys did pick AI. Do you have an AI governance program in your organization? If the answer is no, well, why is that? Is it because AI isn't seen as, is it important? Is it not a top risk for your organization? Or maybe it's a lack of ownership. Figure out what the reason is, because that can be an area that you can actually help drive forward and start to add value and again, break down those silos within your organization. So who owns this? Maybe it should be your team who's owning AI governance. And then start to break down silos between the risk functions. So when it comes to having a strong governance, it's really important to have your silos really broken down. And so you want to make sure that that risk can ultimately be a standing item for the board and executive. And let's say you use AI, and this is one. This is a great thing that's top of mind for executives. Most organizations that I'm talking to right now have actual mandates from the board saying, I want you guys to start to use AI. I've even heard in a lot of places that they're saying you're not going to get more resources because AI exists now. So that is a compelling event and a need that you can start to kind of work on. So first and foremost, establish governance clarity. Whichever one of the function it is, hold that, define ownership, accountability, make risk oversight a standing board, figure out what it is that you want to focus on and how can you get that on the committee at the executive meetings, and then align structures to eliminate silos kind of across those teams overall. And that's where you can think critically about what's the most important thing to the board. And that's how you can start to also get on their agenda. So if it is AI right now, if it is, let's say you're trying to get into an emerging market, maybe you're in manufacturing and there's a new risk you have to think about from your supply chain, whatever it is, get on the radar of the board. Second is you want to drive execution discipline. So what this means is you want to have shared KPIs across the functions, and you want to be able to sustain adoption, speed, and consistency. So again, if you think about maybe a team that you can partner with on this, the first one was that governance. So for this one, let's say it's cybersecurity. You really want to work with cybersecurity, or maybe it's your IT department. You know, they have set KPIs that are important to your organization. So how can you have a shared one? What do you care about? What do they care about? And what of those have overlap? And that can be a shared KPI that you guys can talk on and report on together and ultimately make an impact on together as well. And then make assessment cadence non-negotiable. So if there is a new one, what type of assessment can you guys go out there and do? Make sure you guys have an assessment structure that's not once a year, but you're actually able to do an assessment with a compelling event as well. And then third, scale the market leadership. So balance the breadth and depth of framework adoption, ensuring resilience other than surface compliance. Think critically about your program overall. Scale AI responsibly. Embed AI into your daily workflows with validation and governance to become a trusted enabler, not just kind of this unchecked experiment that one person is working. And ultimately, treat risk as a compliance overhead, but as a driver for your organization. Make it be your competitive advantage. Think critically about why your program is set up the way it is, where you can make improvements, and then ultimately how you guys can kind of work across the board. So leaders who kind of go forward, start to build out this path, you're going to start to get out of that overall, that middle maturity trap as well. And so on here, we have kind of the final slide around the laggers and the leaders. So reactive are the laggers, they're siloed, they just update their controls, their frameworks, everything when needed. Leaders are proactive, they're connected. They're kind of continuously getting through this and working together overall. So the choice is not whether to act, but whether to build a system that endures. And that's really ultimately the crux of assurance overall, or the resilient organization overall. And I know we're kind of up on time here, and we also have Q&A. So I tried to answer some of the questions as I saw them in the chat as we were going through. So we saw questions around what the middle maturity trap is, what AI tools am I talking about? There's some questions around the telemetry data. So that's proprietary data from AuditBoard here as well. You guys can download the risk intelligence report and actually see a lot of these insights that I talked about as well. I believe they're in the resources section on here. And then I saw some questions that's around how did you get your clients to kind of change their behavior overall? So again, that comes to the collaboration side. So first and foremost, always think about what's in it for them. How can you help them get what they want? So what are their core objectives? What are their KPIs? Where are the overlap and how can you help them? Start small, find a champion, and grow kind of throughout there. And on that, I want to say thank you so much for spending time with me. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out as well. And then Marissa, I will pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. And for those of you who are not familiar with AuditBoard, AuditBoard provides an award-winning connected risk platform for audit risk, IT security, and ESG teams that helps you elevate your teams, engage the front lines, and close the risk exposure gap. To learn more or schedule a product walkthrough, please visit auditboard.com. We're also excited to share that registration is open for our 6th InfoSec Compliance Now event. This is a completely free, completely virtual event running for half a day on February 25th. In an expanded session lineup, InfoSec and risk experts will cover topics like building an AI governance program, cyber risk management strategies, third-party risk management, and more. Register today and earn up to 4 CPE credits for tuning in. The link is available within your resource list on the left. And with that, we'll end today's webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions, please reach out to webinars@auditboard.com. And don't forget to follow AuditBoard on LinkedIn and our other social channels to stay up to date on future events, content, and news. We hope to see you next time. Thanks, everyone.